At first, I thought Harold had taken the last thing my mother left behind. And then something moved inside her sewing tin, and I knew I couldn't go home yet.
Ruth Peterson found out her mother's house was sold when strangers were already inside choosing which walls to tear down. No warning, no final walkthrough. No chance to touch the kitchen table where her mother once rolled pie dough before sunrise. Just a red sold sign in the yard and her ex-husband's name buried in the paperwork. At 62, Ruth stood by the gate near Chillicothe, Ohio, holding the only things they allowed her to take: a sewing tin, a chipped teacup, a recipe book dusted with flour from hands that were gone forever. Inside the house, someone laughed about replacing the cabinets. Ruth did not move. Then her phone rang. Harold. His voice was calm enough to sound rehearsed. He said the sale was legal. He said she was confused. He said grief made old women remember things wrong. Then he said the one sentence no guilty man should ever say: "There's nothing left for you to find." But hidden beneath the thread in that sewing tin was a brass key. And that key led to a forgotten cabin where Harold had buried the letter Ruth's mother wrote before she died. Subscribe before we go further, because what Ruth finds in that cabin proves her mother feared Harold long before Ruth understood why. The house looked smaller once Ruth Peterson knew it had been sold. The porch still leaned the same way. The white paint still peeled near the gutters. The kitchen window still caught the Ohio sun. But it no longer felt like home. It felt claimed, stamped, taken. That was what Harold had done. He had taken Ruth's mother's house and treated it like paper. The new owners were polite. That almost made it worse. They did not know they were standing inside Ruth's childhood. They did not know the scuff near the hallway came from the year her father dragged a piano across the floor by himself. They did not know Eleanor had planted rosemary beneath the kitchen window because she believed every kitchen needed something living nearby. To them, it was a fixer-upper outside Chillicothe. Old bones, good lot, quiet road. To Ruth, it was the last place where her mother still felt close. She remembered being 7 years old at that kitchen table while Eleanor rolled pie dough with steady hands. Flour dusted the wood. The radio played low. Her mother did not speak much when she worked, but Ruth had always felt safe in that silence. That was what Harold never understood, or maybe he understood it too well. Maybe that was why he wanted the house gone before Ruth could look through it properly. Not because it was worth money, because it was worth memory. Ruth stood at the gate with the cardboard box pressed against her coat. The wind pushed gray strands across her face, but she did not brush them away. From inside came the snap of a tape measure, then a man's quiet laugh, then a woman saying the kitchen cabinets would have to go. Ruth closed her eyes. Those cabinets had been painted pale yellow by her mother during a summer when money was thin and pride was all Eleanor had left. The brush marks were uneven, one drawer stuck in damp weather. But Eleanor had done it herself. Harold had always hated that kitchen. He called it outdated, cramped, sentimental. He used that word whenever he wanted Ruth to feel foolish for loving something. Sentimental. As if remembering made a person weak. As if an old woman should apologize for wanting one piece of her mother left untouched. But Ruth had learned, over the years, not to defend every feeling. Defending herself only gave Harold more room to correct her, so she stayed quiet, even now. She looked down at the cardboard box. Her mother's sewing tin sat on top, dented at one corner, the painted flowers nearly rubbed away. Ruth had almost left it behind. The new owner had found it in the back room and asked if it mattered. Ruth had said yes before she understood why. Now the tin felt heavier than it should have. Not expensive. Important. There was a difference. As Ruth shifted the box against her hip, something inside the tin moved. A small sound, metal against metal. She froze. For one breath, the house, the voices, the wind, even the sold sign seemed to fall away. Then she remembered her mother's voice from years earlier, weak from sickness but enough to cut through time. Some things must be kept where greedy hands cannot reach. Back then, Ruth thought grief had made Eleanor suspicious. Now she was not so sure. Because Harold had sold the house before Ruth could search it, and her mother's sewing tin had just answered with a sound Ruth had never heard before. Ruth did not open the sewing tin in the driveway, not with the new owners still inside, not with Harold's words still sitting cold in her ear. "There's nothing left for you to find." She placed the cardboard box in the back seat and shut the car door gently, as if too much noise might break whatever was left of her composure. The tin sat beneath the recipe book, still, quiet, but Ruth knew what she had heard, metal against metal. Something inside it had moved. She sat behind the wheel and looked at the house through the windshield. The sold sign blurred at the edges, but she refused to cry there, not where Harold's cruelty could still feel organized. That was what made him dangerous. Harold Whitaker never looked cruel from a distance. In town, he looked reliable, pressed shirt, polished shoes, a calm voice at the bank counter. The kind of man who knew county clerks by name and made impatience look like intelligence. When Eleanor first became sick, that calmness had felt like help. Ruth could still remember those months. The kitchen table buried under forms, insurance papers, hospital papers, estate papers, county notices folded into neat stacks beside Harold's briefcase. Ruth was spending her days between the clinic, the pharmacy, and the hospital outside Chillicothe. At night, she slept in the chair near her mother's bed, waking whenever Eleanor coughed or reached for water. She was not thinking about property. She was thinking about oxygen levels, medication times, soup cooling on the stove, how to smile when her mother asked if she looked better. Harold stepped into that exhaustion with a pen in his hand. He said he was protecting the estate. He said medical bills could swallow a family if things were not handled properly. He said taxes were complicated. He said Ruth did not need another burden. And because Ruth was grieving, because she was tired, because he was still her husband, she believed him. He never shoved papers in front of her. That would have been too obvious. He slid them across the table slowly, turned the pages for her, tapped the line where she should sign. "Just here," he would say, then another page, and here. Sometimes Eleanor watched from the recliner near the window, a quilt over her knees and suspicion in her eyes. Her body was failing, but her mind was not. One afternoon, Harold stepped into the hallway to take a call. The moment he left, Eleanor reached for Ruth's wrist. Her fingers were thin, her grip was weak, but her eyes were urgent. She looked toward the small back room where she kept her sewing things, then back at Ruth. Her mouth moved. Ruth leaned closer. But before the words came clear, Harold returned. He smiled, that clean public smile. Then he told Eleanor she should rest, and Ruth let the moment pass. For years, she told herself her mother had been confused from pain medicine. Now, outside the sold house, Ruth no longer believed that. She looked into the back seat, at the box, at the tin, at the one thing her mother had tried to point her toward. Then another memory rose. Not a feeling, a date. A winter afternoon, Harold had brought a document to the kitchen table and said it only confirmed what they had already discussed. Ruth remembered the date because she had not been home that afternoon. She had been at the hospital for hours. She remembered the pale blue curtain around Eleanor's bed, the cup of melting ice chips, the nurse writing the time on a whiteboard, her mother's hand searching blindly for hers. Ruth's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. If she had been at the hospital that day, then what had Harold filed with her name on it? And why had Eleanor tried so hard to send her to the sewing tin before the truth disappeared with her? Ruth drove away before the new owners could wave goodbye. She could not bear one more polite smile, not after being allowed to carry pieces of her mother's life out in a cardboard box. The road outside Chillicothe stretched past bare fields, leaning mailboxes, and ditches full of brown winter grass. Ruth kept both hands on the wheel, but her mind stayed in the back seat. With the sewing tin, with that sound, metal against metal, she checked into a roadside motel just before dusk. The room was plain, thin carpet, a crooked lampshade, a heater that clicked before every breath of warm air. It was not comfort, but it had a lock. For that night, that was enough. Ruth placed the cardboard box on the small table near the window. The sewing tin sat on top, faded flowers painted across the lid. Eleanor had kept that tin beside her chair for as long as Ruth could remember. Buttons went in there, needles, thread. Tiny scraps of fabric, Eleanor said, might matter someday. Ruth touched the lid, cold, Ordinary, but her hand did not move for several seconds. Because if something was hidden inside, then Harold's sentence was not just cruelty, it was fear. She opened the tin, the smell rose first. Old cotton, lavender soap, thread, a faint trace of her mother's dresser drawer. Inside were wooden spools, pearl buttons, needles tucked into folded cloth, and a silver thimble worn smooth at the edge. Nothing strange, nothing secret. Ruth almost laughed at herself. Then she noticed the tray did not sit flat. One corner lifted just enough to catch the light. She slid her fingers beneath it and raised it slowly. Something dropped beneath the tray and struck the bottom. The same sound, metal against metal. Ruth stopped breathing. Under the tray was a brass key darkened with age. A strip of yellowed tape clung to it, marked with 2 faded initials, RP. For 1 second, Ruth thought it meant her. Then she found the photograph beneath it. A small cabin stood beneath heavy trees. Weathered boards, stone chimney, narrow porch, a dirt path disappearing behind it. Ruth sat down, the memory came back unevenly. A truck bouncing down a rutted road. Her grandmother's hands firm on the wheel. Her mother silent in the passenger seat. Something square and metal resting in Eleanor's lap. A box. Ruth had forgotten the box. Or maybe no one had wanted her to remember it. She turned the photograph over. Eleanor's handwriting waited on the back, thin, careful, unmistakable. When you have nowhere else, go where your grandmother kept the truth. Ruth read it twice. Her grandmother's name had been Rose Peterson. RP, the same initials, the same bloodline. The same hidden road Ruth had not traveled since childhood. She looked at the key again. It no longer felt like an object. It felt like instructions. Then she saw one more folded strip tucked beneath the photograph. She opened it carefully, a property marker number, and one final sentence. Written smaller than the rest. If the ground has been turned, do not dig until you know who came before you. Outside, headlights swept across the motel wall. Ruth looked from the note to the key, to the old cabin in the photograph, and for the first time, she understood something terrifying. Her mother had not only left her a way forward, she had left her a warning. Ruth did not sleep much that night. The motel heater kept clicking. Cars passed outside in soft waves of light, but the real noise was on the table. The key, the photograph, the property marker number, and that final warning from her mother. If the ground has been turned, do not dig until you know who came before you. Ruth read it so many times, the words began to feel less like ink and more like a hand on her shoulder. By sunrise, she had made coffee in the motel lobby and packed the cardboard box back into her car. She did not feel brave. That mattered. Because bravery at Ruth's age did not always arrive like fire. Sometimes it arrived as tired hands turning an ignition key. Sometimes it looked like an older woman driving toward a place she had avoided for 50 years. Because the past had finally started calling her by name. The road out of Chillicothe was quiet that morning. Mist rested low over the fields. Fence posts leaned into the gray light. Farmhouses sat far back from the road, their windows still dark. Ruth placed the old photograph on the passenger seat. Every few miles, she glanced at it. The cabin in the picture looked almost swallowed by trees. But behind it, barely visible, stood the curve of a low hill and the split trunk of an oak. That was the landmark she remembered, not clearly, but enough. The property marker number led her to a county road that had changed names twice since her childhood. Her phone lost service after the first turn. The pavement narrowed, then ended. Gravel took over, then dirt. Then a rutted lane that looked less like a road and more like something the woods had tried to close. Ruth slowed the car. Branches brushed both sides like fingers. And with every bump in the road, another memory loosened. She was 8 again, sitting beside her grandmother, Rose Peterson, in an old green pickup that smelled of tobacco, rain, and peppermint candy. Rose drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near a metal lunch pail on the seat. Ruth remembered asking if they were lost. Her grandmother had laughed once and said, "Some places only look lost so the wrong people won't find." At the time, Ruth thought it was a joke. Now she gripped the steering wheel harder. Because maybe Rose had never joked about the cabin at all. Maybe the women in Ruth's family had been hiding more than a place. Maybe they had been hiding proof. The road dipped near a dry creek bed. Ruth crossed slowly, tires crunching over stone. Ahead, the trees opened just enough for daylight to spill through. Then she saw it. The cabin, smaller than memory, darker too. Weathered boards, sagging porch, stone chimney. One front window clouded with dust. For a moment Ruth could not move. The photograph had not lied. The cabin was real, still standing, still waiting. Then Ruth looked down at the muddy lane in front of her car. Her breath tightened. There were tire tracks pressed into the soft ground. Fresh ones. Not from years ago, not from weather. Someone had driven this road recently. Someone who knew where the cabin was. Ruth turned off the engine. The silence rushed in. And somewhere inside that silence came the first real question she was afraid to answer. Had Harold found the cabin before she did? Ruth stayed in the car longer than she wanted to admit. The engine was off, the woods were quiet, but the fresh tire tracks in the mud made the whole place feel occupied. Not by a person she could see, but by the idea that someone had already come looking. She looked at the photograph on the passenger seat, then at the cabin ahead. Same porch, same stone chimney, same oak tree standing beyond the back corner like it had been waiting through every season. Ruth had forgotten it. The brass key rested in her coat pocket. She could feel its shape against her palm before she even touched it. For a moment she almost turned around. That would have been easy. Drive back to the motel. Call no one. Tell herself the note was old. The tracks could belong to a hunter, a surveyor, a lost driver. But Ruth had spent too many years explaining away things that made her uneasy. Harold's tone, Harold's timing, Harold's papers, her mother's warnings. This time she got out of the car. The cold air moved through her coat. Under her shoes, the mud held fresh impressions from another set of tires. They were wide, deep, recent enough that rain had not softened the edges. Ruth followed them with her eyes. They stopped near the cabin, then turned around hard, cutting into the dirt as if whoever came had left in a hurry. She climbed the porch steps slowly. One board bent under her weight and complained with a low creak. The front door was closed, but the lock had scratches around it. New scratches, bright lines in the old metal. Ruth took out the key. Her hand trembled once. Then she steadied it. The key turned with a stiff click. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust, cold ashes, and old pine. Light slipped through the dirty windows in pale strips. The room was small, a table, 2 chairs, a black iron stove, shelves lined with jars, folded cloth, and things too ordinary to be accidental. At first glance it looked abandoned. Then Ruth looked closer. Dust had been disturbed near the stove. A braided rug was crooked, one corner turned under. A drawer beneath the table sat open by an inch. On the far wall, a shelf had been shifted just enough to leave a clean line where it used to rest. Someone had searched, not carefully, not like family, like a person who knew something was hidden but did not know exactly where. Ruth stood in the center of the room and listened. No footsteps, no voices, only the soft settling of old wood around her. Still, she did not feel alone. Near the back door, mud marked the floorboards. The print was partial but large, a man's boot maybe. The back latch had splintered where someone had forced it from outside. Ruth remembered Harold's polished shoes, then remembered something else. After the divorce, he had bought a pair of heavy work boots for a property inspection job he kept complaining about. Dark brown, thick soles. He wore them once to her mother's house and left mud on the kitchen mat. She had cleaned it. Of course she had. The memory made her stomach tighten. Ruth moved to the back door and opened it. The hinges groaned. Behind the cabin, the ground sloped toward the old oak tree from the photograph. Its branches spread wide, bare against the gray sky, and beneath it, the earth was wrong. Most of the ground was packed hard with winter cold, but one patch looked softer, darker, recently turned. A shovel leaned against the side of the cabin, half hidden behind dry weeds. Ruth took one step down, then stopped. Her mother's warning rose in her mind. If the ground has been turned, do not dig until you know who came before you. Ruth looked back at the muddy boot print,
Into the cabin.
then at the fresh tire tracks, then at the disturbed earth beneath the oak. Whoever had come here had searched the cabin, found something, and buried it again. And Ruth was beginning to understand why Harold had needed her to believe there was nothing left to find. Ruth did not dig right away. She stood behind the cabin with the cold moving through her coat, staring at the patch of dark earth beneath the oak tree. Her mother's warning had been clear. Do not dig until you know who came before you. But Ruth already knew enough to be afraid. Fresh tire tracks, mud on the floor, a forced latch, a shovel left where someone had tried to hide it quickly. And somewhere behind all of it, Harold. Ruth turned back toward the cabin and stepped inside. She did not touch the shovel yet. Instead, she walked through the room slowly, forcing herself to look like her grandmother might have looked. Not frightened, careful. She checked the shelves, the drawer, the floor near the stove, the back door. She looked for anything that might tell her who had been there. That was when she saw it. Near the muddy boot print caught between two floorboards was a small torn corner of paper. Ruth bent carefully and picked it up. It was damp at one edge. The print was faint, but she could still read part of a word. Urson Trust. Her breath caught. Peterson, her family name. The paper was not from an old letter. It was too clean, too white, recently torn. Someone had brought paperwork to the cabin, or found paperwork here, then tried to leave with it. Ruth looked toward the back door again. The oak waited beyond it. This time she took the shovel. The handle was rough against her palms. The blade was muddy but not rusted. Someone had used it recently, then left it behind. Ruth stepped toward the tree. The ground near the roots was soft enough that the shovel entered on the first push. That alone told her something. This earth had been opened before. Not long ago. She dug slowly, not because she lacked urgency, but because she was afraid of damaging whatever lay beneath. Each movement sent a small shock through her shoulders. Her knees ached. Cold mud clung to the hem of her coat. But she did not stop. The shovel struck something hard, a dull metal sound. Ruth froze. For a moment, the woods seemed to hold its breath with her. Then she dropped to her knees and moved the dirt by hand. The object was wrapped in oilcloth, blackened by soil. She pulled it free inch by inch until a metal box appeared beneath the mud. It was smaller than she expected, no bigger than a bread box. But it felt heavy when she lifted it. The latch had been bent outward, scratched by something sharp. Whoever found it had tried to force it open, failed, then buried it again. Ruth carried the box into the cabin and set it on the table. Her hands were shaking now, not badly, enough. She found an old screwdriver in a jar near the stove and worked it beneath the damaged latch, once, twice. On the third attempt, the metal gave with a sound that cracked through the room. Inside were papers wrapped in plastic, a property survey, a bank envelope, a folded document stamped by the county, and on top of everything, a letter. Ruth knew the handwriting before her mind could accept it. Eleanor's. Her mother had written her name across the envelope. Ruth. Not formal, not legal, just Ruth. The room blurred. She sat down before her legs could fail her. For several seconds, she only held the envelope. Her thumb moved across the letters of her name, tracing the shape her mother's hand had made before death took it away. Then she opened it. The first line did not explain the land. It did not mention money. It did not begin with fear. It began with love. Eleanor wrote that if Ruth was reading the letter, then something had gone wrong in the way she had feared. She wrote that she had watched Harold for years, watched how he corrected Ruth in front of others, watched how he answered questions meant for her, watched how he smiled when taking control of things that did not belong to him. She wrote that Ruth was not foolish, not weak, not blind, only tired, and married to a man who knew how to make exhaustion look like consent. Ruth covered her mouth. No one had ever said it that plainly. No one had ever named the things she had lived through with such tenderness. She read on. Eleanor had suspected Harold was asking about the house for reasons that had nothing to do with protection. So before her final illness worsened, she contacted an old attorney who had once worked with Rose Peterson. Rose had never trusted easy men, Eleanor wrote. That line almost made Ruth laugh. Almost. The cabin and the land around it had not been left loose in the family estate. Rose had placed it in a separate trust years earlier. Eleanor had updated the paperwork before she died. Ruth was the beneficiary. Only Ruth. Not Harold. Not creditors. Not anyone who came smiling with a pen. Beneath the letter was proof. The property survey showed the cabin and 16 wooded acres. The county document carried Ruth's name. The bank envelope held photocopies of old records Eleanor had hidden away because she feared Harold would search the house after her death. And then Ruth saw the last page, a copy of a document she supposedly signed, a document giving Harold authority over decisions connected to her mother's house. The signature at the bottom looked familiar, almost, but something in it was wrong. Ruth held the page closer. The first letter was too sharp, the spacing was cramped. The pressure looked heavy, impatient, not like her hand, not like her name. Then she saw the date. Her body went cold. She knew that date. She knew exactly where she had been, not at a desk, not beside Harold, not signing papers. She had been at the hospital, holding Eleanor's hand while a nurse adjusted the oxygen tube. Ruth lowered the document slowly. Outside, a branch scraped against the cabin wall. Inside, the truth began arranging itself. Harold had not only sold the house, he may have built the sale on a signature Ruth never gave, and the letter her mother left behind had not just opened the past. It had pointed Ruth toward a crime. Ruth stayed at the cabin table long after the first shock passed. The letter lay open beside her. The county papers were spread across the wood, but her eyes kept returning to one thing: the signature. Her name sat at the bottom of the document like an insult wearing her handwriting. Ruth Peterson. Close enough to fool someone in a hurry. Close enough to pass through a quiet office. Close enough for Harold to point at it and say, "See, you agreed." But Ruth knew her own name. She had written it on school forms, bank slips, birthday cards, grocery checks, hospital papers, and every sympathy note after her mother died. A person's signature changes with age, but it does not forget its own rhythm. This one was wrong. The R leaned too hard, the P was cramped, the line under the name pressed deep like someone had been impatient to finish. Ruth touched the page with 2 fingers, not the signature, the date. That was what made her stomach turn. February 11th. She did not need a calendar. She remembered that day because the hospital had called before dawn. Eleanor's breathing had worsened overnight. Ruth had driven through sleet with her coat over her nightgown, terrified she would arrive too late. The nurses had moved her mother to a monitored room. There had been a blue curtain, a plastic chair, a cup of ice chips Ruth kept holding to Eleanor's lips' lip, and a whiteboard where a nurse had written the date in green marker, February 11th. Ruth had spent that entire afternoon at the hospital. She remembered Harold arriving near evening with coffee she never drank. He had kissed her on the forehead in front of the nurse, then said he had handled a few things so she would not have to worry. Handled. That word came back now with a different weight. Ruth looked again at the document. According to the paper, she had signed that same afternoon in an office downtown, in front of a notary, beside Harold. Impossible, not unlikely, impossible. The cabin felt colder. Ruth reached for the bank envelope and searched through the copied records Eleanor had saved. There were receipts, property notes, a folded hospital discharge sheet, a small card from the attorney's office with a name typed across the front, Martin Keene, attorney at law. Ruth remembered the name faintly. Her grandmother had once spoken of a man named Keene who kept his word even when it cost him clients. The card was old, yellow at the edges, but the phone number had been crossed out and replaced by another in Eleanor's handwriting. A newer number. Eleanor had meant for Ruth to call him, not someday, when the truth finally reached her. Ruth placed the card beside the suspicious document. Then she took out her own driver's license and held it under the window light. Her current signature sat there, small and familiar. It did not match the one on Harold's paper. Not perfectly, not naturally, not enough. For years, Harold had made her feel uncertain about simple things. Where she put a bill, what she agreed to, whether a conversation happened the way she remembered it. He did it gently enough that doubt became part of the house. But this was different. This was paper. This was date. This was proof, sitting under her hands. Ruth folded the document carefully and slid it back into the plastic sleeve. She did not want anger to make her careless. That, too, felt new. She was angry, but she was thinking. Outside, the wind moved through the oak branches. Inside, the cabin held still around her, as if waiting to see what she would do next. Ruth gathered the letter, the property survey, the trust copy, the attorney's card, and the document with the wrong signature. She placed them in the metal box. Then she stopped. Near the bottom of the bank envelope was one more item she had missed: a photocopy of a county request form. The paper showed that someone had asked for records connected to the cabin parcel months before the house was sold. Ruth read the requester's name. Her hands went still. Harold Whitaker. He had not stumbled onto the cabin after the sale. He had been looking for it before, and if Harold had searched for the cabin months ago, then the house may not have been the only thing he planned to steal. By morning, Ruth had made a decision, not a loud one, not the kind people notice from the outside, but inside her, something had shifted. She was no longer carrying a box of old papers. She was carrying a question Harold could not explain. Why had he searched for the cabin before the house was sold? Ruth locked the cabin carefully, then drove back toward Chillicothe with the metal box wrapped in an old towel on the passenger seat. Every bump in the road made the papers inside shift softly. That sound kept her awake, kept her focused. The county records office sat inside a brick building near the courthouse square, between a tax office and a room where people renewed car tags. It was the kind of place Ruth had passed for years without thinking much about what lived inside. Deeds, transfers, names, dates, proof. The things quiet people rarely look for until someone uses them against them. Ruth parked across the street and sat for a moment before going in. Her hands were cold. She almost heard Harold's voice again. "You do not understand these things. You are making yourself look foolish." But this time she did not answer him in her mind. She picked up the metal box and crossed the street. Inside, the office smelled of paper, toner, old folders, and coffee left too long on a warming plate. A woman behind the counter looked up from her computer. She was around Ruth's age, maybe older, with silver hair pinned neatly and reading glasses hanging from a chain. Ruth expected impatience. Instead, the woman waited. That small mercy almost undid her. Ruth gave her name, then her mother's name, then the parcel number from the note. Her voice stayed steady until she asked for records connected to the cabin land, the old family trust, and the sale of Eleanor's house. At the mention of the house, the clerk paused. Not long, but long enough. She typed for several seconds, then looked at the screen with a stillness Ruth recognized. The stillness of someone seeing a problem and deciding how much to say. The first records came slowly. The cabin parcel had not been part of Eleanor's house. It was separate, 16 acres, wooded land, old transfer history. Rose Peterson's name appeared first. Then Eleanor's, then Ruth's, clear, direct, no Harold, no shared ownership, no confusion. Ruth stared at the printed copy until the letters steadied. For the first time since the sold sign, something official said what Harold had tried to erase. This belonged to her. But the clerk was not finished. She pulled another record. Then another. The sale of Eleanor's house had gone through with an authority document attached. The same kind Ruth had found in the box, the same date that could not be right. February 11th. Ruth felt the room narrow around her. The clerk lowered her voice. There had also been a records request months before the sale, for the cabin parcel. Ruth already knew the name, but hearing it in that office made it heavier. Harold Whitaker. He had not guessed, he had investigated, and he had done it before Ruth even knew the house was in danger. The clerk printed the request form and slid it across the counter. Ruth looked at Harold's signature. This one was real, sharp, controlled, certain of itself. At the bottom of the form, a small note had been typed by the records office. Copy requested for private property valuation. Ruth read the word twice. That meant Harold had not been looking for family history. He had been looking for worth. Land worth. Cabin worth. Whatever else he thought Rose and Eleanor had hidden beyond the trees. The clerk hesitated again, then said there might be archived trust references not visible in the front system. Older records sometimes required a manual pull. Ruth watched her disappear into a back room lined with file cabinets. Minutes passed. 5. Then 10. The office clock ticked above the counter. Outside, cars moved around the square like nothing in the world had changed. When the clerk returned, she carried a thin folder with a yellowing label. Peterson Family Trust. Ruth's throat tightened. The clerk opened it carefully and looked down. Then her expression changed. Not shock. Concern. She turned the folder slightly as if deciding whether Ruth should see the page before she spoke. Ruth leaned forward. At the top was her grandmother's name. Below it was Eleanor's, and beneath both, in typed legal language, was a line that made Ruth grip the counter. The cabin land was protected from transfer, sale, or outside claim, unless Ruth Peterson signed in person before 2 witnesses. Ruth had never signed such a thing. The clerk looked at the document again, then quietly reached for the phone. Because somewhere in those county records, someone had tried to make Ruth's name do something Ruth had never done. Ruth left the county records office with copies pressed flat inside a brown envelope. She did not walk fast. She did not look around like someone being chased, but every step felt different now. The sidewalk outside the courthouse square was the same sidewalk she had crossed many times before. People passed with coffee cups, car keys, grocery bags, ordinary errands. No one knew what Ruth carried. No one knew that inside the envelope were records Harold had never expected her to find: the cabin trust, the land restriction, the records request, the impossible signing rule, the proof that her name had been used in ways her hand had never agreed to. For years, Harold had made truth feel soft, a thing that could bend if he spoke firmly enough. But county paper did not bend that way. Dates stayed dates, names stayed names. Signatures either belonged or they did not. Ruth reached her car and sat behind the wheel. The metal box rested on the passenger seat. The brown envelope sat on top of it. For a moment, she only breathed. Then her phone rang. She knew before looking. Harold. His name glowed on the screen like a stain. Ruth let it ring. Once, twice, 3 times. Then she answered. Harold did not start with anger. That would have been too honest. He started with concern. He said he had heard she was asking questions downtown. He said small towns were full of people who liked to talk. He said he worried she was upsetting herself over things she did not understand. Ruth looked through the windshield at the courthouse steps. She said nothing. Harold kept going. He told her old property records could be confusing. He told her trusts were complicated. He said Eleanor had never been good with legal matters, and Rose Peterson had been stubborn enough to create problems long after death. That was the first crack. Harold had never spoken Rose's name before. Not once in all the years Ruth had known him. Ruth's hand tightened around the phone. He continued, smoother now, as if filling silence gave him back control. He told her the house sale was final. He said the buyers had rights. He said if Ruth tried to challenge anything, she would look bitter, unstable, like an aging woman who could not accept that life had moved on. There it was, the old blade, wrapped in a calm voice. For years, that tone had made Ruth shrink. This time, it made her listen closer. Harold said lawyers would take her money. Clerks would pretend to help. People would act sympathetic, then laugh once she left the room. Still, Ruth said nothing. The silence bothered him. She could hear it. His breathing changed. Then Harold made his second mistake. He said, "Whatever you think was in that box, Ruth, it does not change the sale." The words entered the car slowly. That box. Ruth turned her head toward the passenger seat, toward the metal box wrapped in the old towel. She had not told Harold about it. She had not told anyone except the clerk that she had documents. She had not said metal box, not once. Outside, a truck rolled past the courthouse. Its engine faded down the street. Inside the car, everything became very still. Harold seemed to realize the silence had changed. He tried to correct himself. He said he meant whatever papers Eleanor may have left behind. He said old women hid things all the time. He said Ruth was building a fantasy out of grief and dust. But the damage was done. He knew about the box. He knew because he had seen it. Maybe he had tried to open it. Maybe he had bent the latch. Maybe he had buried it again under the oak because he could not risk leaving it in the cabin. Ruth looked at the envelope on the passenger seat. The county records had spoken. Now Harold had too. For the first time, Ruth understood that she did not need to argue with him. She only needed to let him reveal himself, so she spoke softly, not with fear, not with apology, just enough for him to hear that something in her had changed. She told him the records office had been very helpful. Harold went quiet, a hard quiet. Then he said she was making a mistake. Ruth looked at the courthouse again, at the brick walls, the public steps, the place where names and dates could outlive lies. Then she ended the call. Her hands shook after. Of course they did. Courage did not make the body forget years of control, but she did not call him back. She did not explain. She did not defend herself. She placed the phone face down, started the car, and looked once more at the brown envelope. Harold had searched for the cabin. He had known about the box. And now he knew Ruth had reached the records before he could stop her. The next move could not be hers alone. She needed someone who understood paper better than Harold did. Someone her mother had trusted before the truth was buried. And in the metal box beneath Eleanor's letter, Ruth still had the old attorney's card. Ruth found the attorney's card beneath Eleanor's letter. The corners were soft. The ink had faded, but the name was still there. Martin Keene, attorney at law. Below the old office number, Eleanor had written a newer one by hand. Ruth stared at it for a long moment, then she dialed. She expected a dead number. Instead, a woman answered from a small office on Paint Street, not far from the courthouse square in Chillicothe. Martin Keene was retired now, she explained. But he still came in 3 mornings a week for old family matters. Old family matters. Ruth looked at the metal box on the table. That was exactly what this was. By noon, she sat across from Martin Keene in an office that smelled of paper, coffee, and lemon polish. He was 82, thin, clear-eyed, careful with silence. When Ruth placed the metal box on his desk, he did not ask what it was. He touched the lid gently. Then he said Eleanor Peterson had always been smarter than people gave her credit for. That was when Ruth knew she had come to the right place. She gave him everything. The letter, the trust papers, the property survey, the county records, the request form with Harold's name, the document with the signature that should not exist. Martin read slowly, not because he was old, because he understood what careless reading could cost. Page by page, the truth began to stand up. Rose Peterson had created the cabin trust decades earlier, quietly, legally, firmly. The cabin and 16 wooded acres could not be sold, transferred, or claimed by anyone outside the family, unless Ruth appeared in person and signed before 2 witnesses. Ruth had never done that. Eleanor had updated the trust before she died. She had named Ruth clearly. Only Ruth. Then Martin placed Harold's records request beside the disputed authority document. Months before the house was sold, Harold had searched for information on the cabin parcel, not after Ruth found the key, before. Then came February 11th, the day Ruth supposedly signed away authority over her mother's house. Ruth handed Martin the hospital record from Eleanor's file. It showed Eleanor had been admitted before dawn. It showed Ruth listed as present through the afternoon. The same afternoon, Harold claimed Ruth had signed papers downtown. Martin looked at both documents. He did not smile. He did not promise victory. He only said, quietly, that Harold had a real problem. The fight did not end that day. Real justice rarely moves fast. There were calls Ruth dreaded. Forms she did not understand at first. Certified copies. Questions from people who spoke carefully. Letters from Harold's attorney, cold enough to make her hands shake. Harold claimed Ruth was bitter. He claimed she had misunderstood the estate. He claimed Eleanor's papers were sentimental clutter. That word again, sentimental. Ruth read it at the cabin table with the stove ticking softly nearby. For years, that word had made her feel small. This time, it did something else. It made her angry, not loud angry, clear angry. Her mother's handwriting was not clutter. Her grandmother's trust was not clutter. The cabin key was not clutter. And the truth was not clutter, simply because Harold had failed to bury it deep enough. Still, there were nights Ruth nearly quit. The cabin was cold. The roof leaked near the stove. The back steps sagged. Her hands ached from sorting papers and sweeping dust out of corners. Nothing about the comeback looked grand. It looked like an older woman making coffee before sunrise, reading documents twice, calling the courthouse again, and learning to say, I need that in writing. It looked like fear staying in the room, but no longer making the decisions. Martin built the timeline piece by piece. Eleanor's hospital admission, Ruth's presence at the hospital, the disputed document filed elsewhere, the notary tied to Harold's business circle, Harold's request for the cabin parcel, the fresh search marks inside the cabin, the bent latch on the box, and Harold's own mistake on the phone. when he mentioned a box Ruth had never told him about. Martin said people like Harold often trusted control more than facts. They believed if they sounded certain enough, everyone else would stay confused. But facts did not need confidence. They only needed daylight. The settlement came before a public hearing. Harold did not apologize. He did not confess with bowed head. Men like Harold rarely surrender that cleanly. But he signed. The sale of Eleanor's house was financially corrected. Ruth received compensation from the contested transaction. The buyers, who had not known the truth, were allowed to keep the house after proper legal adjustments. Ruth could have hated them. She did not. They had been used too. Harold's name did not come away clean. The notary issue was referred for review. His role in the paperwork became part of the record, and his reputation in town changed in the quiet way reputations do. Not with shouting, with pauses, with people looking twice, with greetings that became shorter than they used to be. For a man like Harold, that was punishment he could feel. But Ruth's real victory was not in his embarrassment. It was in the cabin. The trust was confirmed. The land was hers, publicly, legally, completely. The first thing Ruth repaired was the porch step. Walter Brooks, an old neighbor who remembered Rose Peterson, came by with lumber in the back of his truck. He told Ruth that Rose once said land was only safe when the right woman knew where the papers were. Ruth smiled, a small smile, the kind that comes after a long winter. By late spring, the windows were clean. The stovepipe was fixed. The back door had a new latch. The oak tree stood full and green above the place where the box had been buried. Ruth planted rosemary beneath the kitchen window, not because the cabin needed it, because Eleanor would have. She placed her mother's photograph on the wall. Beside it, she placed an old picture of Rose Peterson, stern-eyed and straight-backed, looking like a woman who had never apologized for knowing the truth. The metal box stayed on the shelf, unlocked. Inside were Eleanor's letter, the trust papers, the county copies, and one new page Ruth wrote herself. Not for court, not for Harold, for whoever came after her. She wrote what happened plainly, so no woman in her family would ever have to wonder whether her memory was enough. 1 year after the sold sign, Ruth drove past her mother's house. The shutters had been painted blue. The porch looked different. The lilac bush was gone. For a moment, grief rose in her chest, sharp, honest. Then it softened, because Ruth finally understood something Harold never had. A house can be sold, rooms can be emptied, cabinets can be torn out, but love that prepares a way forward, love that hides a key, love that leaves proof beneath old thread, that kind of love is harder to steal. Ruth drove back to the cabin before sunset. The porch light was on. Smoke lifted from the chimney. Rosemary moved gently beneath the window. For the first time in years, Ruth did not feel like a woman standing outside her own life. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her, not to hide, to rest. Harold had sold her mother's house because he believed he was taking the last thing Ruth had. But beneath cold Ohio dirt, Eleanor had left something stronger than property. She had left truth. And truth, once opened, does not go quietly back into the ground. If Ruth deserved justice, give this story a like. Subscribe before the next story begins. Because too many people lose everything not from weakness, but because someone they trusted kept the truth out of reach. And tell us in the comments, was Ruth right to let the innocent buyers keep the house? Or should Harold's fraud have cost him every inch of what he tried to steal?